Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, The Data Tipping Point, a panel discussion. I'm your host, Evelyn Mitchell, Senior Analyst at Insider Intelligence, and today I am joined by a very special panel, so let's meet them. We have my colleague, Paul Verna, who is a Principal Analyst here at Insider Intelligence. We also have Anthony Caccioppoli, Head of Ad Tech and Solutions over at Insider, our parent company. And we have Damian Garbaccio, Chief Business and Marketing Officer at Affinity Solutions. It's wonderful to have you all here.
Great to be here.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we dive into our discussion, I'd like to thank Affinity Solutions for making today's webinar possible. And we have a few things for you before we dive in. While I have questions of my own planned, this is also an opportunity for you to ask your questions about your data pain points. You know, we're here to help you tackle them. Just use the chat window on the right side of this video feed to submit them at any time, and then we'll get to as many as we can at the end of our session. There's also no need to take notes if you'd rather not. We will email you a link to view the full recording of today's presentation, and don't forget to grab a copy of our guide, The Data Tipping Point, created together with Affinity Solutions, and you can find that in the resources tab below the video feed. All right, so let's get started. I want to kick things off with kind of a high-level landscape question about data. So there's no shortage of customer data today. You know, according to research from Ascend2, over a third of marketers use a wide variety of data, from customer service history, transactional history, location, social, you name it. And since a lot of this data is currently based on third-party cookies, which we know are not long for this world, Damian, can you talk to me a little bit about what's next for data and what marketers, you know, should be testing out to better connect with their customers?
Absolutely, and I appreciate. I think just to go back to your earlier comment, the data tipping point. It is a page turner, must read, and just some wonderful insights there that speak to our first question about data. And yes, there's a lot out there. There continues to be a lot out there, but there is this receding water of cookies going away and some other sort of inertia of privacy and regulatory things that are happening, which I'm sure we'll hit on. So data is evolving. It is changing. One critical piece is around, before we get to the value of that data, the signal. You know, at Affinity and other companies out there are representative of a strong signal of data, meaning it's valuable and it will exist and weather the storm of cookies and regulatory. So there's will this withstand the different forces that are changing it? So you need data that's durable, sustainable, and that has a strong signal. And secondly, the collection of that data obviously goes without saying. There's a privacy and regulatory component, but it's also, is it easy for brands, agencies, media partners, and others in the ecosystem to capture this data and collect it in a privacy compliant way? So if you take those two sort of underpinnings and table stakes for the business, you look at, you know, sort of what's valuable, and what do you want to do with that? And at Affinity, and I believe a lot in the market, believe that transactional or consumer purchase data is not only extremely valuable, it is indicative of a lot of things, both your own first-party data as a brand and competitive data sets. So as we'll talk about later, I'm sure any data sets that are fully permissioned, have a strong signal, withstand it, and provide value back to the brands, marketers, and media companies in terms of consumer purchase are sort of what I would say is the top of the list of data that continues and will grow in value.
Wow. So there's a lot to dig into there. And you're right, we will touch on a lot of this as we move forward. So one of the things I want to pick up on is the idea of signal loss. Like you mentioned, strong data with strong signal is very important as we move into the cookieless future. And there's an element also of connecting the dots between disparate data sets. And that playground is what we call the identity landscape. Paul, you recently published a report on identity resolution in advertising. What kinds of cookieless identity solutions are seeing the most uptake? And are you able to share some best practices for advertisers that are trying to navigate what can seem like an endless sea of choices in the identity landscape?
Well, there's a lot going on in the space. As we all know, it's kind of a wild west right now. We're definitely in a period of flux and a lot of testing and learning, a lot of experimentation. The timeline for the full deprecation of cookies, if we go by what Google has signaled, which we know has changed a couple times, it's a long timeline, and it's been in progress for a while as far as just the whole landscape shifting away from legacy identifiers. So that's sort of good and bad. On the one hand, I think a lot of companies feel like, we can keep putting it off. We've got time to work on it. But then as it gets closer, you realize that, other companies may be ahead of you, and there a certain urgency kicks in. So amid all of this flux, I think what we're seeing is experimentation with universal IDs. And by that, I don't mean like a single identifier, but more, some of the company-led or industry solutions that have been proposed that are either interoperable or at least are trying to sign up a critical mass of partners. There is, of course, the shift to first-party data, and that can take on many guises, as I'm sure we'll get into more. There's a lot of experimentation with data clean rooms. And then there's a little bit of like everything old is new again sort of thing with contextual targeting kind of like coming back into vogue, and a lot of use of probabilistic solutions. So with all of that, and I'm just kind of giving a snapshot, but there's obviously a lot more to the flux. But as far as best practices, what we recommended in the report that you mentioned, Evelyn, is first to just continue to test and learn with deterministic and probabilistic approaches. There's a lot of benefit in both, in hybrids of the two. So I think we're not done with the experimentation. Second one I would say is don't wait for Google to do whatever it will do or not do in the time that it's said it's going to act. So Google has twice delayed the planned phase out of Chrome cookies, but that's not really like a boy who cried wolf scenario. It's really more like a sign to kind of prepare and try to get ahead of whatever's going to happen from now on. A third one is don't wait for privacy laws. I know we're going to talk more about privacy, but there's a lot going on in the regulatory and legislative landscape. But again, in the same way that I think waiting for the outcome is a mistake because it gets you behind the curve, this is a similar situation with privacy laws where, yes, they may take a while to enact. There's kind of like a slow, roll, but better to get ahead of the curve than to get stuck behind it. And then the last best practice is, this is a little bit of a dark horse in this whole identity landscape, but don't assume that IP addresses are here to stay. There's a lot, there's more and more chatter about IP addresses because they're considered PII in a lot of territories and jurisdictions, that they may go the way of other identifiers. So right now, the CTV world relies almost entirely on IP addresses, and that may not be the case, or at least some things about how to use them may change.
Absolutely. Yeah, IP addresses are definitely one to watch, and we'll see this year. I feel like there might be a little bit more momentum behind, the will they, won't they of deprecation there. Awesome. Anthony, I have one for you. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing? Paul mentioned first-party data. And yes. So we got to talk about it. It is one of the hottest kind of data topics these days, and rightfully so, I think. And what are you seeing as the most effective uses of first-party data from your vantage point and insider?
Yeah, so before I get into the details of that answer, I do want to echo what Paul said. We have to diversify our portfolio of IDs and solutions. So for us at Insider, right, we have to look at what we have today from a first-party data asset. And a lot of it is consumption data based off of first-party cookies, some mobile ad IDs, and so on. But what I want to do is take those data points and create audiences that are actually valuable in the market. So when I look at the successes and the use cases I'm testing out, the most success that we've had so far is with our thematic audiences. And what that means is it's kind of taking contextual and applying it to the entire site, but using themes. So think of bucketing audiences into a specific theme like technology readers and so on, and making sure we can target those users consistently across all types of articles that they may read, not just bucket into one particular content or section. So that's actually been very fruitful and successful for us. And it's actually helped bring in more direct advertising dollars.
That's really interesting. And I think, I love hearing from publishers about what they're doing with their first party data. But I've also heard on the buy side a little bit of skepticism about publisher first party data supported targeting solutions. So have you had any conversations with buyers where, like, what would you say to a buyer that's coming to you with concerns about your product? How do you address those?
I would first say that no one knows our users better than us. If they want to trust a third party to define our users for us, it's inherently murky waters, I would say. It's not that we don't work with these third parties like data providers to help us enrich or inform our users in terms of what else are they in market for, are they a C-suite exec, et cetera. These are insights we definitely want, right? Because we don't inherently ask our users about that. But we do go out and partner with these users, these partners directly, because it actually helps us and it's very mutually beneficial. I also would say to a brand that we would work directly with them to build a more direct relationship in informing each other's users. So that's something on the far, far out there. But I want to build more direct relationships with the brands because I want to be able to do both, let's call it insider data enrichment of their users and vice versa. As well as be able to do different testing, right? So it's going to be a long shot, right? Because we need to test it. We need to make sure that the brands are on board. We need to make sure privacy concerns are addressed. But when you look at the shift in the market, it's going from status quo to more direct. So building those direct partnerships with data providers, building those direct relationships with brands, and also helping innovate with the current ad technologies, especially the SSPs like Magnite, Podmatic, et cetera, is going to be very, very fruitful. But they also need to be able to address anonymous users, which is the majority of most publishers in our tier, right? So that's where my head is at.
Ooh, there are so many questions here. I'm really excited to see where it goes. Damian, what are some effective uses of first party data that you're seeing from your vantage point at Affinity?
Yeah, so it's interesting just in listening. By the way, also very helpful to Paul and Anthony. The themes we talk about and the complexities we talk about, if an alien being came in, or even frankly, anyone off the street and listened to what we're saying, you'd think this is the most complex, disjointed industry that ever existed. So I can't help but think simplification is needed. It's a reminder when I first joined the industry, like everyone else, and I'm dating myself here, but my parents never understood what I did and still don't really. But when you say advertising and making it more effective, people get it. I think they don't get all the different steps and issues and technologies and stakeholders that are involved. So it's just fascinating when you sit and listen in webinars like this, that to have one solution or to have simplicity here is very difficult. So, but back to your question, Evelyn, because it relates. I think when you're talking about first party data or any real data for that matter, is we try to think, given all that's going on, simplicity of value and of course access is critical. So when specifically at Affinity and for other folks out there in the landscape of media data and metrics, we have deterministic consumer purchase data at scale across the US by capturing credit and debit card information. So if you want to think about it this way, is we have the first party data of most retailers, QSR, anywhere where your credit and debit card is swiped. And the reason that's valuable is because, one, it indicates direct action that a individual has taken, a consumer. It gives information about where they're consuming, the amount that they're consuming, not only on the, let's call it a first party retail brand, but also across the landscape of their competitive set. So we see wallet view. It's not just, when you think about some of the businesses out there that are really leveraging first party data, like Insider and others, but specifically on the demand side or the brand side, is they're using, and I'm sure we're going to hit on the retail media networks, they're using their data and have a very interesting silo by which to view purchases for their products that they capture. What we think is important from the data landscape is not only seeing that, because that's the first party data that's important, but also then being able to widen the aperture and understand, okay, if you're a QSR, you want to talk about the people who are eating hamburgers at your restaurant, but you also want to understand the people who are eating chicken sandwiches at your competitors' restaurants and why that is. Similar in the retail space around your products or services versus competitors and what's that impact. So I think first party data is extremely valuable. It's going to be extremely sticky and per our earlier conversations, a little scarce. So people need to mine that gold and figure out ways to leverage it beyond the already valuable things that are happening today in retail media networks and some other applications.
Absolutely. Well, then on that point, I guess, of data enrichment and kind of sourcing data from different locations to build a really powerful strategy, I think the elephant in the room here would be privacy. Privacy legislation and regulation are changing. We've mentioned it a couple of times already, so let's talk about it head on. What are some ways that advertisers can improve the longevity of their data strategies right now? We all know there are a lot of questions that are still waiting to be answered, things that are waiting to be litigated, bills that are waiting to be passed, and I think everyone can acknowledge that questions will go unanswered for a little bit, but we still have to start working on this problem right now. So what are some tips that you all could share with advertisers to help with that?
I think advertisers need to zoom out and remember that the whole mess that we're all in with the erosion of identifiers really started with a thrust toward consumer privacy, really with GDPR, and then all of the kind of dominoes that fell from there. So we're basically in a time, like when we look back historically at this time period, this will be a time when we've kind of pivoted from unfettered access to third-party data to a much more privacy conscious view of the world. And that's really just continuing with all the the legislation we talked about. And I know, Evelyn, you're going to be working on a report that actually maps the US and where all of the different bills that are in progress or have already been enacted, where they stand and how it's all shifting. And then it's also a global issue because, if you're a global company, which most companies are, then whatever the threshold is, say in Europe, is going to affect your business. So Europe is usually the tip of the spear when it comes to consumer privacy. So there's just a lot going on a business level, on a regulatory level, on a legislative level. And I think you just have to open your eyes to all of it, keep abreast of all of the changes. I know it's a lot to keep up with, but there's really no alternative, because if you don't embrace or at least comply with this more privacy-oriented view of the world, you're going to get left behind even more than you have already by the changes that we've seen in the last few years.
Yeah, and I want to echo what Paul is saying, and I also really want to come at it from the point of view from a content owner. So as a content owner, you want to make sure that the users who come to your site are browsing safely and we're adhering to their consents. And what that means for us is to increase the transparency of that value exchange. Why come to insiders' properties? While also showcasing that there's certain needs we need on our side to operate our business. So it's more about making it clearer to the user without making them go through all these hoops and ladders of accept all, manage and so on with, vendors that they might even, most consumers, I have to say, don't even know of, right? Manage my cookies per partner, per technology and so on. So what I would say from the content owner point of view is get ahead of these regulations and kind of see how you can get in front of it with the consumer while also implementing these consent changes on your website.
Yeah, I mean, all fantastic points. And by the way, it goes back to, especially when Paul was speaking, who's obviously in the weeds on this stuff. And I look forward, Evelyn, to your paper on that, you hear about this. Why does anyone want to get into this industry? You hear about all the complexity. But that said, agree with both my panelists here. I think you have to be aware of not only the privacy regulatory and sort of which way the winds are blowing and be proactive there. Agree 100% with Anthony in terms of that's their job and any publisher and content owner to make sure that happens. As a data and measurement business, I sort of think that we play sort of not underneath, but along all of that. And what I would say is, besides those two areas that we hit on, I think the thing that we capture most and think of as most valuable is consent. We have data that is fully consented. It's almost double consented, actually, just to make sure we are clear, and the partners we work with are part of this regulatory and privacy environment and are super strict. So we're very clear and good about adhering, but we want to make sure that no matter what happens, no matter what way the wind blows in terms of privacy, that regardless we have consumer consent, and that's critical.
It is critical. I think, as Paul's mentioned, I do study privacy regulation and legislation, or I research it for Insider Intelligence. And at the heart of it all should be the consumer, that kind of overlays everything we've talked about. Trust from Anthony and consent from Damian. All of this is, make sure that your organization has the consumer's best interests at heart, and don't always assume what the consumer knows and doesn't know. Maybe that's a good place to start as well. About not just about our industry, as Damian has mentioned, it's very confusing. So maybe that's not a good place to start, but just coming at it from, put your consumer hat on. What would creep you out, or what kinds of data would you want to have a little bit closer purview over? And that's a good place at least to start, because if you focus on the consumer at the heart of these, the waves of legislation and regulation that come next will hopefully be a little bit less brutal. All right, so let's move on. Paul, you mentioned a little bit ago universal identifiers, and we appreciate the distinction between a universally applicable identifier and what the concept of a universal identifier actually is. Is it realistic to expect a universal identifier or a universal identifier that the industry can really rally around? And just before you answer, I'll pop up this piece of data here, because according to research from ID5, only 36% of marketers worldwide said their platforms support up to 3 first-party universal data IDs. So I'm curious what your perspective is on that rallying around identifiers.
Well, I mean, I referred to a Wild West, and maybe the Wild West gets tamed a little bit in the next year or two, but not to the point where there's going to be like a single solution that looks anything like what a browser cookie looked like or what a mobile identifier looked like. So, you have things like the Trade Desk's UID2, you have LiveRamp's Ramp ID, you have ID5, they have a universal ID. And then you've got some like the Advertising ID Consortium and SWAN and all sorts of proposals and initiatives and consortiums that are trying to solve this problem. But I don't envision the industry rallying around any one of these solutions. I think it's very analogous to what's going on in TV ad measurement or TV ratings, where you have Nielsen, which was that sort of like, you know, they were kind of like the universal ID in terms of being the single currency that, though imperfect, was accepted by pretty much everyone up until a couple of years ago. And then there was this sort of seismic shift, and now we're in a place where a lot of parties, including Nielsen, are still kind of vying for acceptance, but there's no indication that we're moving toward consensus anytime soon. So I think we have to accept that the market is going to be fragmented for a while, and probably maybe indefinitely. And at best, I think we can assume that there are, you know, maybe a small handful of alternatives that kind of work for different parties, but not one that's just, you know, where everybody's going to speak the same language.
Well, on that point too, there's no one size fits all approach to identity. I want to talk a little bit about outcomes and outcome based advertising and measurement. Damian, you mentioned that Affinity Solutions measurement is a big part of what you do, and there's been a lot of ink spilled about outcomes based measurement. What would you say to a brand that's looking to shift to an outcomes based approach in this somewhat confusing data landscape that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, it is confusing, and it's funny when Paul was speaking earlier, he said, you know, first of all, he was referencing it's like the measurement landscape. I thought he was going to say it's like our political landscape in terms of not getting along, which I agree with both of those things. And it's true. I don't, it's like, well, back when you played Little League, or I did at least, you know, everyone's, who goes first, you get to the top of the bat, everyone's trying to be this solution on top. So we'll see. You know, just as an aside, I think that Paul's last point about, you know, there might be 2 or 3 that are generally accepted. And I think companies potentially like an Experian or others that are trusted in other areas can add value to that market. But on the outcomes front, I think it's less of companies, or it's certainly companies trying to ensure that they have outcomes-based marketing and advertising, but it's being sort of thrust upon them and being a demand because of media accountability, because of efficiency, and frankly, because of waste and cost. So, you know, there's an expression now that everyone's being all advertising is performance advertising. And luckily, from the business model we have, and by no means are we the only ones, but when it comes to consumer metrics and consumer outcomes, that's our sweet spot. So, you know, as we think about Affinity as a massive scale data set of consumer purchase data, and we always talk about, you know, advertising in the beginning and proxies for advertising and marketing outcomes. We take that proxy and bring it to purchase. So we try to really close that loop. We try to say, yes, all marketing and advertising should be outcome based, because the outcome at the end of the story, the best proxy for a sale of something is the sale. So when we talk about outcomes, our data is used primarily not only in the activations space in terms of targeting, but for planning. So you should plan and account for your media where you think it's going to have the best outcome. Activate and buy where it's going to have the outcome, and make sure you measure and optimize. So that's a huge part of Affinity's DNA. And just as an aside, we launched last week our new data and tech platform called Comet. But the whole premise for that was, you know, I had always thought in the last couple of years, we were chatting with Anthony earlier about some of my prior lives and roles, and it was always trying to get that outcome, trying to close that loop, trying to find, you know, that connective tissue. And we thought about, you know, do you want to read a book and that's really compelling and just stop with about 30 pages left, or do you want to watch a movie, you know, 2/3 of the way through and then not watch it? And we kept thinking about it. Affinity, this data that we have, it tells you what happens. And so we started to think and have the mantra at our company is, we are what happens. So Affinity Solutions, we are what happens because of outcomes. And that's where we're hanging our hat. That's what we think is not going away. I know people are trying to solve across the board for outcomes, and we're happy to be knee deep in this stuff.
Awesome. Well, looking forward to see what else comes out of that excellent mantra. We are what happens. I've got to say, props for that.
Thank you.
All right, let's pivot and talk about two of the hottest topics right now, which are, of course, CTV and retail media. We at Insider Intelligence talk about these all the time. So let's start with CTV, which is an absolute goldmine when it comes to audience targeting, at least compared to its legacy linear counterpart. According to research from PubMatic and Advertiser Perceptions, well over half of US advertisers surveyed cited a variety of targeting methods that they use in their CTV strategies, including user audience targeting, contextual, cohort, and location. So how can advertisers bring non-publisher data, first-party assets or data accessed through a partnership like with Affinity Solutions into the fold to help strengthen or otherwise, augment their targeting in CTV? And maybe we'll start with Paul here.
Yeah, I mean, CTV is what it is, and in our forecast, it's the fastest growing of the major ad formats, and faster growing this year than retail media, actually, which is the other kind of skyrocketing format. So there's a reason for that, and that is because it has all of the things that we have known and loved about TV advertising for generations: the sound and picture, the engagement, the fact that everybody's sort of, even if you don't like ads and tune them out, there's a certain comfort level with that, 30-second or 15 or 1 minute ad. So you take that and you combine all of the targeting, the richness of the data that it returns to you, and it's really a winning combination. There are obviously a lot of issues with it. I mean, there's certainly some potential ad fraud issues that have to be worked out. There's just a lot that's not quite there yet, and there's also the constant tension between being able to target, but then knowing that at the end of the day, it's a household device that's being beamed into a room full of people who may be of different ages and genders and income levels and tastes and anything else. So, but I think at the end of the day, just the fact that it has these capabilities that it seems are being honed as we go and will get better, I think that makes it really powerful. And we show in our forecast of TV ad spending, we show this sort of stacked chart where we have like linear TV and then CTV on top of it. And then you just see how when you look up and to the right, the CTV share of it keeps getting bigger and bigger. So there's no mystery as to where things are going. It's obviously going to take a while, but it's all coming from the data and the capabilities of the medium.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Damian, go ahead.
No, it's growing in such a massive way, and in many ways, it's actually, even though you may not see it on your whatever it is you stream or everyone streams, because some of the actual operation, people are just throwing every dollar at this stuff, and if you actually look, like, I mean, I've seen shows where I've gotten 5 AT&T ads in a row, and I'm a 10-year Verizon customer. So it's just not, it's still, eventually that train is going to slow down a little, and it's going to be more accountable. That's where the data will come in more and more. However, it's incredibly valuable. It's growing. In many ways, the application of data is way easier given its digital format. So we're extremely bullish on it. We interesting enough, we launched a metric. So we mentioned Nielsen and some of the other fragmentation. One line that cuts through on the outcome side is purchase, the purchase media metric we have. And we started working with Analyst on linear TV because it's not addressable and because it didn't have that as a direct line and ease of use to do it. So we started with a medium that was a little harder, but obviously the fast follow is in CTV because of the growth that Paul mentioned. And I think down the road, when the technology catches up, or at least gets adopted, and there's more competition, it's going to be fantastic. The measurement and data applications that we can truly leverage in CTV.
And Damian, can I just say thank you for bringing up the thing about the frequent ads, or, you know, frequency capping in industry jargon, because I don't think there's a single person who hasn't experienced that. And I think when you talk to a lot of you know, streaming platforms or practitioners in the space, they sort of brag that, you know, it's a great experience, and they kind of gloss over that part of it. But that's the complaint I hear again and again, and I feel your pain. I've been there with these ads that are irrelevant to begin with, and then served again and again and again, hearing like sometimes twice in between innings of a Mets game. So yeah, we've got a ways to go.
We've all had our pain points there. I've been targeted with repeated ads for medication for older men, and I'm like, I'm not there yet or ever. So I hear you. All right, before we get to our last non-audience question for the panel, I want to just make sure that that the audience remembers to keep them coming. We'll get to you very soon. We just got one more about retail media networks, which I'm sure you're all curious about anyways. So this last one, and then we'll get to your questions. All right. So retail media networks, everyone wants in on this trend. Like Paul mentioned, it is currently the second fastest major ad channel that we track. And then next year it will outpace CTV a little bit. It just keeps on growing. Everyone wants in on it, all the retailers, but there are, of course, still some growing pains, as there are with any skyrocketing channel. So according to the ANA, a little over 80% of marketers in the US are saying a lack of standardization across platforms is pretty tricky for them. You know, garden walls, timeliness of data, those are challenges too. And of course, it is expensive. So will we see any of these obstacles, you know, coming down soon, and how soon, if so? Maybe Paul, you can speak to this one.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a gold rush, and yeah, as you point out, Evelyn, the growth curve with retail media is going to surpass CTV next year, which is saying a lot considering where CTV has been and still is. And I fully agree with and support that forecast, but I do think there could be somewhat of a reckoning with, you know, just the amount of money that's flowed into the space, and the retailers that are just blindly going into it, and the assumption that it's going to scale across the whole purchase funnel as opposed to where it is now, which is really essentially a performance and attribution oriented form of advertising. I don't think the walled gardens I don't think those walls are going to come down at all. I think the walled gardens are very powerful and want to hang on to their data. And one of the issues with retail media is that virtually every one of the networks is becoming a bit of a walled garden. I mean, Amazon, of course, is the 800-pound gorilla in the space, but there are others that are also scaling up quite a bit, and they're approaching it in a similar way where, you know, what they share is limited. So I think there's going to be a lot of tension, and at some point, maybe a realization that, you know, retailers rushed in a little too soon with eyes closed. So again, I think it's a vibrant space. I do think the forecasts are accurate, but I also think that not everybody's going to be happy when, you know, they kind of cycle through the next phase.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to take away from anyone else speaking, so I'll make it quick. But I think all the things Paul was referencing are not only true. I think, by the way, I just started a retail media network. I don't know how. It seems like everyone is. Just right now on the.
I actually used ChatGPT to start mine.
Yeah. I think I did. We started the webinar and 2 popped up. I mean, I think it's going to eventually right size itself, only because one, a lot of the retail media networks that are set up are really, even though they're using that, it's all about their first party data. They're outsourcing it to other tech providers or media extension providers, et cetera. So I do think it's valuable. I think one thing that's missing, and this is selfishly for our company, we help, but also I think in general, like if you're a Walgreens or if you're Best Buy or Home Depot with one or anyone, you have the line of sight into your customers, but what you don't understand as competitive customers is your performance actually worse than your competitors in this time frame or better, and how do you compare them? So I think the versatility of them, besides, and Paul references as a very basic performance and quasi-attribution solution, is TBD. I don't know how much that'll grow. I think there's value. There's certainly value in it. I just think it needs to evolve. And eventually, I don't know if all 1,000 or whatever there are going to exist down the road or not.
Absolutely. Well, we have a live audience question that is directly applicable to this very discussion. So I'm going to start with that one. Are there any recommendations that the panel has on closing the loop with the end customer who's buying from a third-party retailer like Amazon to get that first-party data back, you know, when those partners are walled gardens, when the transaction is essentially hidden from the brand itself? And maybe, Damian, you can talk a little bit about what Affinity can do there.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a great question because that coming from my X-Late and then Nielsen days, one of the most interesting feedback that I got or comments from clients, big brands and retailers and so forth was, hey, can you get us, or can you share with us our own first party data? That's what they would literally ask us, because we had businesses that captured that. And most of the time, whether it's walled gardens or even in the context of if it's a brand that's sold through retailers, sharing that data back is non-existent. So to a certain extent, some of that's not going to change. Most of that likely. What we do at Affinity, and I think it's very helpful, and I referenced it sort of in the wallet view and cross shop, but it would be true of any retailer. Since we capture the credit and debit, and it's agnostic to any particular brand, or it's just what you spend, we can capture the data on a particular retailer or any of their competitors. So some of that, if not all of that, it's not every single transaction, but the vast majority we can work, and we do work with companies to share back that data. And if it's for competitors, we enrich data and augment CRM and so forth. So yes, there's a limited group of folks that could probably help you there. Affinity is certainly one of them, but capturing and reaching into the walled gardens and getting data back I don't think that's going to be any easier down the road.
One of the main complaints, I think, that advertisers have there. All right. I have another kind of, marketing bingo type audience question about data clean rooms. I don't know if that was what anyone expected, but of course, in talking about the data landscape, clean rooms are almost inescapable these days. And the question is a little bit broad, what is your point of view on data clean rooms? But perhaps we can reframe it a little bit more to talk about how the state of data clean rooms right now, and whether we see this trend, really helping cut through some of the pain points that advertisers are experiencing with all of their various sources of data these days. Anthony, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Honestly, clean rooms is not the greatest solution at this moment in time for a number of reasons. One, again, speaking from the tier of publishers I'm in, we don't have the scale of authenticated traffic like the big fish do, like NBC, Disney, et cetera, who have tons of authenticated users, predominantly in the email address space. Brands may have a lot about their users in terms of emails, but publishers like us, at most, we can match maybe up to 10% total. That is not enough to really move the needle, so to speak. And even if we modeled it, right, it's not going to be as impactful as addressing all the rest of the users, which is anonymous. So my idea for clean rooms is to adopt identity or probabilistic solutions inherently as part of the product offering to connect the dots for us, or we would just have to find a way to connect the dots on our side to then send those data points to the clean room for matching. That might be a little bit too in the weeds, but it was more about like, I don't think it's the best solution in this current state where we're in the industry.
No, I think it's important. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, Anthony, what you said resonates a lot with what we found in our report, which is that, I mean, among marketers, I think there's a data point from the CMO Council that about 20% are using clean rooms right now, but another 24% were planning on adopting them. But for publishers, it's challenging. You know, it's a different, you know, it's kind of like a different equation comes into play. And I think you articulated it well, Anthony, but, you know, that the value just isn't there. And also they are costly. So, you know, you have to make this big investment, and what kind of return are you getting on the investment? So there are definitely interesting use cases for clean rooms. And I think we will see an expansion in their use. I mean, you know, the IAB just put out its state of data report, and it was like all about clean rooms. So it's definitely the topic du jour, but it's also, you know, there are definitely some limitations.
Yeah, no, it's a valuable space, and I think, but it's not a one size fits all. And I also think from the Affinity perspective, we have some huge partnerships with whether you call it clean room, secure data share, what have you. It's actually extremely beneficial for us. Just not confidentially, publicly, Snowflake is a large partner of ours, and as well as some others. But we view it a little differently because we want to have a conduit to share data and do that in a secure, privacy-centric environment. So for us, it's more about data access and distribution by clients, by those 20% and 24% Paul just mentioned, and potentially down the road, any publisher that would want to ingest data. So it just makes it extremely easy and extremely secure to do what we already used to do, just in a better, more privacy-centric environment.
Absolutely. I think on that point, one of the biggest things that to kind of build on what Paul was mentioning about that we found in our research is that it seems like things are heading toward everyone needing more than one clean room, which doesn't really seem like a solution in the long run, right? It doesn't seem like it's solving the problem at the end of the day. So, you know, TBD, we'll see. The industry is aware of this problem. The IAB, for example, put out some kind of initial standards trying to foster interoperability between clean rooms in a privacy compliant way. So we'll see how it goes. But it's still kind of early days for this tech, even though it's not new by any stretch of the imagination. It's just got some new momentum behind it in this new kind of privacy compliant era that we're in. All right, we have time for one last question here, and it's a really fun one to wrap with, I think. It came up in another recent webinar, and it's a really good question, so I'm excited to hear y'all's thoughts on it. What would be your letter grade, if you had to give one, to the industry as far as being ready for the cookieless future? Anthony, why don't we start with you?
I'm going to give a generous C, mainly because there's a lot of work ahead, right? And there's a lot of solutions that need to be built, especially when it comes to what I call the 3 pillars of the future, right? Addressability, identity, and data enrichment. So once more solutions come about in the industry that can help with anonymous addressability, cookieless addressability in Safari and the likes, right? That's going to be more beneficial and impactful for businesses like Insider. But right now, we're not quite there yet. The big fish haven't really made decisions, so I would give it a C.
All right, Damian, what do you think?
I'm going to say C+. And it's not just because that was my average in school. It's because I think I would have gone with even a C- maybe a year or two ago. I think people have stepped up a little. I still think it's not everyone's fault, the readiness. I think there's too many plates being spun But I do think that we need to move faster with more definitive stakeholders giving clear optionality before we get better. And by the way, there's a lot of procrastinators still out there. So C+.
All right, and Paul, are we
Well,
higher or lower?
I guess, when I look at this thing, I see that it's half full and not half empty. So I'm going to be a little more generous and say B, maybe somewhere between B- and B, but I'll give the industry the benefit of the doubt. I think, to Damian's point, it's kind of unfair to put the whole burden on what some of these big companies are doing unilaterally on everybody else and how disrupted their businesses have gotten. And I think more and more companies are at least realizing the need to act and taking steps accordingly. So yeah, we have a long way to go. I could definitely see the arguments for the C and the C+, but I think we're starting to get to a better place.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. This has been a fantastic panel discussion. I do a lot of these, so this was a really good one. Thanks again to Paul, Anthony, and Damian for joining us, and a very, very special thanks to the team at Affinity Solutions, as well as our eMarketer production crew behind the scenes. They deserve a huge thank you for making this webinar possible, and because we quite literally could not do it without them. As promised, we will be emailing you a link to today's slides along with a full recording of the session, so keep an eye on your inbox for that. And also, don't forget to check out the data tipping point guide that is in the resources tab under this video feed. We created it together with Affinity Solutions, and it's a really jam-packed, excellent guide. And before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you what is happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live analyst and tech talk webinars at eMarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune into Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast, which you can find anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And finally, please check out our newsletters. We have a couple of options across retail, finance, and digital advertising, of course, so there's something for everyone. And if you haven't already signed up, you can do so at eMarketer.com/newsletters. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your workday.